Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss an interesting observation about the difference between the car industry and farming sector in the UK as British cars get ready for export after a little bit of a pause to the United States now that our tariff deal comes into effect. But British farmers are complaining that they've been sacrificed. But is this because they just don't understand how trade works in the 21st century? But for daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel to stay notified. So, article in The Guardian describing how Minis, Aston Martins, Range Rovers are all getting ready to go to the US now that the tariffs are lower on UK cars again from today. But farmers are saying they've been used as collateral to save the car industry. Now, what do they mean by that? And isn't it because they're trying to operate in a trade environment where government manages these things, which doesn't actually exist? So let's go back to the tariff agreement between the US and the UK. Trump had raised tariffs on car imports to 25%. This is very bad news for Britain, which an already struggling sector and with factories in some politically sensitive areas was going to result in job losses. 25% tariffs was going to mean job losses. Simple as that. We had to act quickly. The deal is still not great. The new 10% tariff only applies to the first 100,000 cars exported. So it is still the case that if the UK car industry is looking to expand, it can forget about looking towards America for growth. But at least it will be able to sell what it was doing. And being honest, a lot of sectors in a lot of countries are looking at future trade plans that miss the USA out where possible anyway. They're not exactly a reliable business partner right now. And job losses of any kind are not good for a government, but some are more awkward than others. So we arranged a mutual tariff reduction deal. We got a special arrangement on cars, for example. Trump got a special arrangement on some meat products, for example. It didn't lower the standards, by the way. It doesn't mean the hormone-injected beef. The only agri-food being imported from the US is the stuff which was perfectly legal before. It's just that the tariffs have been reduced, meaning that they can be more competitively priced. Farmers said at the time they understood the situation for the government, but that their sector cannot keep being used to get benefits for others. A reference to the way British farming was also sold out for post-Brexit trade deals under the Tories as well. Of course, the UK-EU deal did focus very much on British farming. In fact, Labour's number one priority was the SPS deal, the agri-food deal, which they got. But a general point about trade was being made about David Hennick, who's an expert on the matter. He was noting that trade policy requires concessions to be made, which sounds an obvious thing to anyone thinking about the process of negotiating anything. Of course, if you want something, you have to concede something. Obvious. But it's not something people talk about, Hennick's saying. He made the point that the UK farming lobby is amongst the weakest in the world, which is interesting. Now, why might this be? I've got an idea. Now, just to be clear, this is just speculation on my part, because I can observe how the British farming lobby works. I don't really know how farming lobbies in other countries do their stuff. I know that in France, they start the occasional fire and sometimes block the streets with straw. That's about it. But I know how farmers in Britain generally operate. See, when Labour are in town, they complain bitterly about everything. We've seen this over the inheritance tax issues and this tariff deal. But when the government actually does prioritise them, as it did with the EU deal, you get a curt nod of the head, but otherwise no sense of appreciation. Whereas when the Tories are in town, they can completely destroy British farming and they still put vote Conservative signs in their fields. I mean, let's look, for example, at some of the things farmers have complained about of late. They say one massive problem with the inheritance tax issue is that farmland is overvalued. It's valued way beyond its commercial productivity, specifically because of other people buying it as investments. Land has become more valuable because you can use it to dodge taxes. But whose fault was that? Thatcher. They didn't like the way the Tories dragged us out of the single market, completely screwing their access to seasonal labour, customers, as well as some supplies. They didn't like several of the Brexit trade deals, most notably with Australia and New Zealand. And yeah, they'll say they protested against it, but it's like, but did they really? There was no bringing London to a standstill over these things, was there? And it's because most people in rural areas are brought up to be forelock-tugging Tories. Not all, I hasten to add before people complain, but most. I've lived all my life in semi-rural areas, and it's what they're like, fed on a diet of land and hope and glory and bunting. Oh, the bunting. Like, they go to the government, oh, government, we're not happy about this. Oh, give them some bunting, they'll be fine. You know, they see themselves in this hierarchy whereby the Tories are preserving this culture, which does them no favours, and Labour are seen as the revolutionary upstarts, right? It means that objections to Labour policies they don't like get dialed up to 11. There's no attempt to bridge anything. On the part of most, there were, for example, over the inheritance tax, there were some farmers who actually just tried to talk sensibly to Reeves about it. But most of them just dialed it up to 11. And just to be clear, I said myself, I'd have done the inheritance tax policies very differently. I don't think Reeves did it right. I quite like the idea of putting the tax up to 40%, like all inheritance tax, but making it payable only when the land is sold. That would protect genuine generational farmers and stop people buying land as a tax dodge, which they still will at 20%. But nonetheless, the objections to the autumn budget were way beyond anything they did about Brexit or the fact that people buy farming land as a tax dodge. You know, and they'll talk about how Labour's tax policy will reduce the amount of land being farmed. Oh, this will lead to less land being used for farm, less land being used for farm. That's bad. What about when tax dodgers buy the land, stick 3 goats and a bucket on it and use it to save their kids some tax? Not a peep. And this has been going on for decades. Not a peep, because it's the Tories who enabled that. So what this attitude leads to is that Labour governments feel they can do no right by them because it goes, so it becomes too much effort to engage. Conservative governments feel they can completely ignore them because they're so deferential to them. So farmers get a raw deal out of either government simply because their attitude to both is not constructive, but in different ways. But Hennig also seemed to add another dimension to throw into the mix here, that corporate giants are responsible for the majority of trade. And these are the main groups lobbying the government. And I guess this is to contrast with a time when maybe the government would effectively just lobby on behalf, like all of these businesses would collect together. You have some businesses that are large and so on, but not like today's mega corporations. So the government would be the one sort of collecting them together and going, okay, right, let's try and see what we can do for you. For example, the total turnover for UK farming last year was just under £8 billion. The total productivity is like 14 billion or something. There are corporations which individually have turnovers, never mind productivity, turnover of tens of billions just for one company. So not only do you have the useless engagement from farming groups to both Labour and the Conservatives, it's equally ineffective to both. But the sector itself is very low value. Yes, it's strategically important because their produce is somewhat essential. We kind of need food. And because importing is more expensive than it was, the more food we could produce ourselves, the better we can tackle the cost of living. Frankly, that's the only thing farmers have going for them. If they were a non-essential industry, they'd be out on their arse by now. But with a stagnant economy and Trump threatening global recession, a sector which is a minuscule part of our overall economy, like I'll do a pie chart of total UK productivity and farming in there, you barely see farming. So in order for the farming sector to mix up, that tiny little sliver there wants to be a big player in trade policy talks, right? How's it going to do that? You know, it needs to mix it up with economic giants when it comes to trade policy. So they already need, just starting, they need to punch above their weight. They need to be more effective than those corporate giants. And yet they're of below average effectiveness in terms of lobbying. Farmers are basically shit at lobbying, and they should probably sit down collectively, invite some trade experts in to discuss with them how the world has changed over the last few generations. They don't seem to have noticed. Work on a more effective strategy. And that strategy is going to need to mean talk more to Labour and demand more of the Conservatives. Because right now, like I say, Labour think they're too high maintenance and the Tories think they're easy votes. And if the farming community doesn't want to engage in a bit of introspection, I'd say get used to being very, very grumpy. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And for more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.